Good evening to you all. On behalf of the trustees of the Needham Research Institute and the Master and Fellows of Clare College, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to the second Needham Memorial Lecture. The Needham Memorial Lecture was established last year, and it is in true Cambridge spirit a joint venture. We gratefully acknowledge the support of the Master and Fellows of Gonville and Caius College, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science, and the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology in helping establish this annual lecture. We're also grateful for support from the Dean Brandt Corporation, who has helped to make this evening possible. Now, we're very delighted to have with us here this evening Professor Justin Yifu Lin, one of China's most distinguished economists. Professor Lin was born in Taiwan, originally trained in the School of Agriculture at the National Taiwan University and studied hydrology. He then transferred to the Republic of China's Military Academy and graduated there in 1975. He then, quote-unquote, transferred to mainland China, although I believe that back then the word used for this was slightly different. And ever since then, he's built up a remarkable career as an economist, studying political economy at Beida, and then moving on to the University of Chicago to do a doctorate in the 1980s. He was one of the first citizens of the People's Republic of China to have a doctorate or to gain a doctorate in economics from the University of Chicago. Now, Professor Lin is a professor of economics at Beijing University and at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And among his notable achievements are a spell as chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. And there too, Professor Lin was the World Bank's first chief economist from a developing country. He is the founding director of the China Center for Economic Research of Beijing University, a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and he's the author of 20 or so books and countless papers, articles, and book chapters. To name just a few very recent ones: The Quest for Prosperity, How Developing Economies Can Take Off, published by Princeton in 2012. Against the Consensus, Reflections on the Great Recession, published by Cambridge in 2013, and hot off the press, a title he co-authored, Beating the Odds, Jump-Starting Developing Countries. It is not Professor Lin's first visit to Cambridge. As a matter of fact, exactly 10 years ago, he delivered the Marshall Lectures in the Faculty of Economics here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lin, whose lecture is entitled The Needham Puzzle and China's Renaissance, a New Structural Economics Perspective.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a great honor for me to deliver the second Needham Memorial Lecture. And Needham is a scholar I admire since I was very young. And I'm honored to discuss one of the main themes of his research career. That was the Needham puzzle, a question he raised, and also the main focus of his research. And I'd like to provide some of my interpretation or my analysis of this puzzle. And the main reason for him to raise this puzzle is that he wanted to understand whether it was possible for China to have a rejuvenation or renaissance. And I also like to provide some of my answers or analysis about the question. And certainly, I like to approach these two big topics from my own branch of development economics, that is the new structural economics. We know that based on the research by Needham, China was one of the most advanced countries in the world before the modern times. And China lost to the West only after the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, which started in Britain. And since then, China all of a sudden lost its momentum, and because economic basis certainly was most important indicators of a country's power. And in 1820s, the economic side in China still contribute to about 1/3 of the global economy. But it declined dramatically by the time of 1978, reduced down to 4.2%. And even after 1949, China made a lot of effort. By the time of 1978, when China started to transit from a planned economy to a market economy, China economic size in the world was only 4.7%. That was according to the Madison's estimation. And according to Max Webb, China was on the verge to have an industrial revolution by the time of the 14th century. Some people even argue before that, Song Dynasty. China was above the same level of technological advancement compared to Britain in the 18th century when Britain started the Industrial Revolution. But China did not have this Industrial Revolution and causing China to lose quickly. And so Needham posed a very challenging question to the people doing research on China. How come China was so far advanced of other civilizations in the pre-modern times, but how come China could not maintain its leadership in modern times? And the answer to these two questions would be very essential for us to make a judgment about the futures of the Chinese economy or China's civilization. But certainly now we know. Needham posed that question in the 1950s. And now, almost 60 years, 70 years have passed. There's a new phenomenon in China. After transition to a market economy in 1978, China became the most dynamically growing country in the world. And by the time of last year, the weight of Chinese economy, recovered to 18.6% of the global GDP. And so that's a raise from 4.7% in the world now to 18.6% in the world. And so, 2 days ago, China just finished the 19th Party Congress. And President Xi Jinping said, China now is the most close to the national rejuvenation compared to any time in the modern history. And certainly, in this lecture, I'd like to analyze a few questions. Why did Industrial Revolution originate in China? Because that was the starting point when China started to lose to the West in the competition. Then how come that China could grow so dynamically after 1978? And why China could not have a similar growth performance before 1978? And during this period of time, certainly, there were many other countries that engaged in similar transition from planning economy to market economy, from government-led economic system to market-oriented system. But most other countries, their economy collapsed, stagnant, hit by crisis. But China maintains stability and dynamic economic growth. How come the performance of transition to market economy was so much different? And certainly, everything has two sides. Every coin has two sides. The dynamic economic growth in China also means China pays some cost for that. And what are the causes? And how to, further improve the Chinese system. And certainly people like to know, can China maintain its dynamic economic growth in the coming decades? And a dynamic economic growth from China is very essential for the world now, especially after 2008 global financial crisis. China contributed about 30% to the global growth every year. And the world economy has now fully recovered from the 2008 crisis. And if China can maintain the dynamic growth, it will be a good news for the world. And if China slowing down, then we may lose the steam of the growth engine in the world. And it will be a challenge for everyone, not only for China. And at the end, I'd like to have a very short concluding remarks from my analysis to these two big questions. Why did Industrial Revolution originate in China? Well, we need to really understand what do we mean by Industrial Revolution. For many people, Industrial Revolution means the use of steam engine, the mechanization of the textile sectors, as well as the use of steel in a daily life. But I think that is not a good definition, because if an economy only had those three new inventions, yes, they may have a one-time jump in productivities, but they cannot have a continuous growth in their economy. Because we know before 18th century, the average annual growth rate of per capita income in the West was only 0.05%. That means it took 1,400 years to double per capita income, even in the West. Certainly for the rest of the world, that was similar. And after 18th century, all of a sudden the growth rate jumped about 20 times. The increase in per capita GDP, was raised from 0.05% to 1%. And the time it took to double per capita GDP was reduced from 1,400 years down to 70 years. And in the West, from the mid of 19th century to now, the growth rate of per capita income was further doubled to 2%. And at the time it took to double per capita income reduced from 70 years down to now about 35 years. The possibility for this kind of acceleration in the growth was not because of the adoption of those three new technologies. It was because of the acceleration in the rate of technological changes, in the rate of industrial upgrading. So to me, the more important definition of Industrial Revolution was how come all of a sudden the rate of technological innovation, the rate of industrial upgrading accelerated, and what caused that? There should be a better definition of Industrial Revolution. The rate of technological innovation, industrial upgrading, all of a sudden accelerated. And that kind of phenomena should be the core of Industrial Revolution. And my hypothesis of how come all of a sudden in the West, the rate of technological innovation accelerated? It was because of paradigm shift. Before the Industrial Revolution, the technological innovation in any society or in any civilization came from the experiences of peasants, the experiences of craftsmen. And after the Industrial Revolution, in the mid-18th century, the way of new technology came mainly from experiment in the laboratory. And after the 19th century, the way of new technological changes came from not only experiment, science-based experiment. And this kind of paradigm shift has a lot of implication for China and for the world. Before the 18th century, when it was experience-based, China had some advantages because China has the largest population in the whole world. It was because of fertile land, the good weather, which was suitable for agricultural production, and China can feed a large population. With large population means you have more peasants, you have more craftsmen, you have more experiences. And that certainly contributes to a faster rate of technological changes in China compared to other parts of the world. And actually, not only China, all the civilization, basically, they are all based on fertile land in the big rivers, like in Egypt, in India, and others. So I think that was the main reason China was so advanced in the past. But when you shift to the control experiment, science-based control experiment, large population lost its importance. Because like Professor Liang, in your laboratory, you could do experiment 100 and 1,000 times within a year. And for that may require farmers or peasants or craftsmen to do in their whole lifetime, right? So China did not have that shift, was the main reason. But the shift to experiment and a science-based experiment was a result of another revolution, the scientific revolution in the 15th, 16th century. And the scientific revolution enabled people to use experiment as a way to find new knowledge on the one hand. And also scientific revolution made a very important contribution in that when you try to do some experiment to find new technology, certainly after you reach a certain level, you encounter some kind of bottlenecks. And then when you encounter some kind of bottleneck, you can engage in scientific research to get more knowledge about the universe. And that will release the bottleneck of doing experiment to find new technology. And this kind of new ways of doing experiment and science-based experiment was a result of scientific revolution. And so if we want to answer how come the Industrial Revolution did not originate in China, we should try to understand how come the scientific revolution did not originate in China. And the scientific revolution is a combination, itself is also a revolution in finding a new way to use mathematical model to explain our understanding of the rule or the law of the universe, and to use control experiment to test the hypothesis derived from this mathematical model. That was the scientific revolution, the spirit of the scientific revolution. And how come that kind of new ways of trying to understand the world did not happen in China? Certainly, if you want to do the scientific observation and so on, you need to be very curious about the world. And also, that you need to be very intelligent. And in China, those kind of curiosity about the world and intelligence is some kind of innate ability. China had a large population. China should have more people who are curious about the world and who are also very gifted. And how come those gifted, large number of gifted people in China did not find out the new way of doing the scientific research, use math and control experiment? My explanation was related to the social political system in China. China had a civil service examination. And those kind of civil service examination, make the common people had a channel to become a ruling class in China. And to be an official in a traditional society was most honorable job, not only most honorable, also highest return job. And as a result, people were attracted to be the officials. And China introduced the civil service examination. If you want to become official, you pass the examination. And the examination after the Song Dynasty required people to memorize the Confucianism, the Confucius textbook, the classics. And as a result, all the young, gifted people, they were attracted to study Confucianism to prepare for the examination, and they did not have incentive to study math and control experiment. And without those kind of acquire human capital, that is mathematics and control experiment, then you cannot have a scientific revolution. And compared to China, the West had a feudalist system. And so there was no disincentive for the bright people to learn math, control experiment, and to fulfill their curiosity about the world. And I think that was the main reason that China that could not have the indigenous scientific revolution. And without indigenous scientific revolution, we could not have an indigenous industrial revolution. Then why we use Confucianism? Supposedly, in the past, actually in the Song Dynasty, when the civil service examination was first introduced, math was also a required content for the examination. But quickly, the emperor found those people who were good at math was useless. And it's more important for the people to be lawyer. And you know that Confucianism indoctrinated some kind of ideology. If you want to be a good man, you need to be loyal to the emperor, and you need to discipline yourself according to the teaching. And by that, those kind of indoctrination, plus the civil service examination, provide China to be able to maintain the integration of such a mass of land and also the social political stability. Even though the control mechanism in the pre-modern time was very backward. But people far away, the officials far away from the emperor, they were disciplining themselves to be loyal. And that was the reason why that China was able to maintain the integration of the country, the stability of the country. So in a way, the civil service examination plus the Confucianism were some kind of institutional innovation. That was good in the old time when the information control mechanism were very backward. But it caused China to be locked in that kind of system because it discouraged people to learn what would be essential for the scientific revolution. And without scientific revolution, when the West had a scientific revolution and an industrial revolution, China all of a sudden lose quickly. And as a result, I already explained, because China all of a sudden from most advanced to become most backward. And one of the quotations I like the most is from a book by Sipla, and the title of the book is European Society and Economy Before Industrial Revolution, and the period the book covered was from 1000 to 1700 AD. And in the last sentence of the book is that in the Dark Ages, that was from 1000 to 1700, the West was basically an agrarian societies, and compared to China at that time, poorer and backward. But after 18th century, all of a sudden, everything reversed. You replace the West with China, and then it will be equally applicable. Okay. And after that, certainly, because the rise of economic power also means military power, political power, China, like many other developing world, were defeated by the UK, Britain, and other Western power, and China become quasi-colony of the Western power. So that was the result of the lack of industrial revolution in China. And how to rejuvenate China is a big issue for Chinese intellectuals. And Chinese intellectuals try all kind of attempts, including the trying to buy technology, try to build up the military power at the end of Qing dynasty, and try the Republic Revolution to overthrow the imperial system, try to have a new cultural movement, and so on. But China did not regain its position until what I already said, 1978. But how come after 1978, China could grow so fast? The average annual growth rate was 9.6%, continuously now 38 years. We never observed such a high growth rate to be sustained for such a long time, and especially in such a large country. And its trade growth rate was even more remarkable. The average annual growth rate of trade in China was 14.8%. And as a result of this kind of very dynamic economic growth, China overtook Japan in 2009 to become the second largest economy in the world, and overtook Germany in 2010 to become the world's largest exporter. So China get a name of the factory of the world. After the Industrial Revolution, Britain was a factory of the world, and then the US was a factory of the world. Germany and Japan was factory of the world. Now China is the factory of the world. And China overtook US in 2013 to be the world's largest trading country. And in 2014, measured by purchasing power parity, China became the largest economy in the world. And how come that all of a sudden, in the last 4 decades, almost everything changes, right? I think if didn't dip up to now, his question about China would be different. And we are going to have a new Needham puzzle, right? And my analysis actually is quite simple. The reason why China was able to grow so rapidly after 1978, it was because of the latecomer advantages. Because after Industrial Revolution, economic growth certainly means the continued rise of per capita GDP, per capita income. But if you want to have a continued rise of per capita income, you need to increase your labor productivity all the time. And how to raise your labor productivity? You need to have a new technology innovation in the sectors you are producing now. Not only so, you also need to have a new stream of sectors which commands higher value added than the sector you are producing now. So you can reallocate your resources, your labor force, from low value added sectors to higher value added sectors. That means industrial upgrading. And those kind of technological innovation and industrial upgrading were made possible after Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned, the rate of growth all of a sudden accelerated after Industrial Revolution because of that. But for the high-income country, the advanced country, since the Industrial Revolution, their technology, their industries have been on the global frontiers. So technological innovation for advanced country means what? Technological invention. Industrial upgrading means what? Also technological invention. You need to invent them. And the invention requires huge capital input and also very risky. And as I mentioned, after the mid-19th century, the average rate of growth in high-income countries, including UK, the West European country, and North America, was about 3% per year. That was based on empirical evidence. But for a developing country, if they want to have a income growth, they also need to increase their labor productivities. But for a developing country, they can either invent the technology, the industry, or they can borrow the technology and industries from high-income countries. And this kind of technological borrowing certainly means the cost will be lower, the risk will be lower, and a developing country, if find a way to tap into the potential, a developing country can grow faster than the advanced country. But how fast it is possible? It's an empirical issue. And after the Second World War, there were certain economies find a way to tap into the potential and achieve 7% or more growth rate continuously for 25 or more years. Certain economy in the world. And China became one of the 13 after 1978. So my answer to the first question, based on my understanding of industrial revolution, was very simple. As a developing country with a gap with the high-income country, that income gap means technological gap, means the gap in value added of the industries. And if a country or an economy find a way to tap into that potential, then it can grow much faster. China found a way to do that after 1978. But if the advantage of backwardness or the latecomer advantages is a reason for the rapid growth after 78, that advantage has been there for centuries, right? After the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, the gap has been there. And the gap become larger and larger, as I mentioned. At the 18th century, China still contributed to 1/3 of global GDP. And by the time of 1949, it reduced down to 4.2%. That means the gap that China with the advanced country has been enlarged all the time. That means that latecomer advantage should be there all the time. But how come China did not benefit from that advantage before 1978? I think it was because China gave up the advantages voluntarily. Because as I mentioned, the national rejuvenation has been the driving force for China's development effort, political effort, after China was defeated in the Opinion War. National rejuvenation, national renaissance has been the main theme for China's effort. Now Xi Jinping called that the China dream. And after the China gained the political independence and consolidation in 1949 with the founding of People's Republic, the attempt at that time, the aspiration at that time was to catch up the high-income country as rapidly as possible. So the Chinese government adopted a strategy called overtaking the United Kingdom in 10 years and catching up the United States in 15 years. So this kind of, orientation of development policy means what? China wanted to build up the most advanced industry like the United Kingdom, like the United States at that time, right? But if you wanted to develop those kind of most advanced industries, on the one hand, they are all protected by a patent, right? So if you want to use those kind of technology, you cannot borrow them freely. You need to pay a high royalty. But in fact, even if you want to pay the high royalties, the advanced country will not transfer those kind of technology to you because they are related to national defense. Right? Those kind of large-scale capital-intensive industry in the 1950s are all related to military power. So China could not get that from advanced country. And by that means what? If you want to develop them, you will have to reinvent the wheels and give up the potential of advantage of backwardness. Well, they come out advantages. That's one thing. Not only so. Those kind of advanced modern sectors are large-scale capital intensive. At that time, China was a poor agrarian economy. And for the capital-intensive large-scale industry, the most important cost of production or investment was capital cost. As a capital skills agrarian economy, capital cost will be very high. So that means what? Firms in those kind of sectors were not viable because their cost of production or investment will be much higher than similar firm in high-income country. And because they are not viable in open competitive markets. So to develop those kind of industry, you cannot rely on market. The government would have to mobilize resources and to invest in those kind of sectors, and also subsidize those kind of sectors in order to, make them that can be established and also can operate all the time. And those kind of government, support will cause all kind of distortions and interventions. And as a result, certainly, you are going to have, some kind of misallocation of resources. And the system would be very inefficient. Not only you get up the potential of latecomers' advantages, you also make the system very inefficient. And that's the reason why that China, even after 1949, with all kind of effort, China's position in the world did not recover. It was just from 4.2% to 4.7%, right? So that was the case. And China, only after 1978, the strategy changes. After 1978, China started to develop those kind of labor-intensive processing industries, which rely mainly on labor inputs. At that time, China was a low-income country, so the labor cost was very low, and so China could have competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. The cost of production in those kind of sectors, China could be competitive with any country. And as a result, they can be competitive in the world, expand the market, make a profit. And once China made a profit with increased accumulation of capital, China can have an industrial upgrading. And when doing the industrial upgrading, it was an upgrading according to the accumulation of capital, the change in the competitive advantages. And so, when you move from one step further, there are still traditional labor-intensive sectors, and there was no pattern production in those kind of sectors. China can borrow technology freely, and so China can benefit from the advantage of backwardness. So the reason why that China did not do well before 78 was because of wrong strategies. And the reason why that China could do well to tap into the potential was a right strategy that trying to emphasize the competitive advantage of the Chinese economy. But if this analysis poses another puzzle, because after the Second World War, almost all the developing countries, no matter which camp they were, in a socialist camp, Certainly, they all follow the Stalinist capital-intensive development strategies. But in the non-socialist camp, in Latin America, in South Asia, in Africa, because they're all gaining political independence from colonial power under the leadership of first-generation political leaders. They all have the dream of making their country to become a high-income country quickly. So after the Second World War, in 1950s, 1960s, all the developing countries, no matter they are socialist or non-socialist, they all rely on government direct mobilization of resources to build up large-scale modern industry on the basis of agrarian economy. Certainly, they did not utilize the late common advantages because they wanted to develop the most modern industries. And they all caused all kind of distortion, government intervention. They were very inefficient. So as a result, their gap with high-income country continue to be widening. And because of poor development performance after 30 years from the Second World War, by the time of 1980s, 1990, China started transition from government growth to market-oriented economy. All other countries adopt similar transition. But transition in the 1980s, 1990s was heavily influenced by the experience in UK, the Churchillism and the Reaganism or neoliberalism. They, at that time, understanding how come the developing country could not do well. Because they have too many government intervention in the economy. They did not have well-functioning market economy, well protection of property right as in the high-income country. And so the recommendation at that time was you need to remove all those kind of distortion in order to establish well-functioning market economy and to improve performance. And the recommendation was to adopt certain kind of big bang approach for structurality to have a privatization, marketization, liberalization, stabilization simultaneously. But country followed that strategy. The result was a collapse of the economy, stagnation, and then frequent crises. And the performance of the developing country in the 1980s, 1990s was even worse than the 1960s, 1970s, because their average growth rate in 1980s, 1990s was lower than in the 1960s, 1970s. And the frequencies of the crisis were even higher. And so some economists refer the 1980s, 1990s as lost decades for the developing country. And how come that was the case? Because the neoliberalism failed to recognize that the distortion was designed as a way to protect non-viable firms in the auto priority sectors, the heavy industry capital-intensive sectors. If we remove all those kind of distortions, that means they are not viable, so they will go bankrupt. And if you allow them to go bankrupt, you will create a huge unemployment and causing social instability, political instability, and how could you develop economy? And sometimes the country would not allow those kind of firms to go bankrupt, even after privatization, because they are in the capital-intensive advanced sectors, and many of them related to military, national defense. Without that, you are not going to have a national defense, just like in Russia today. And so after the privatization, actually, the government would have to subsidize those kind of firms. And in fact, after the privatization, the subsidies increased instead of reduced. The reason is because when those kind of industries were owned by the state, the operators, the managers, were state employees. They would come to the government to say, without protection, we cannot survive.
But after they receive protections, at the most, they could have on-job consumption. They could not put the money into their pocket. If they put those money into their pocket, it's a crime, it's a corruption, right? Certainly, they may do that, but they could do that only secretly. But after the privatization, they will not subsidize the government, the state. They will use the same reason to argue for protection and subsidies. But the more they get from the state, the government, the more they can benefit from themselves. So they will have a high incentive to argue for protection and subsidies because to put those kind of money into their pocket is legal. And then they will tell the government official to say, well, you give me the subsidies, but those money are not your own money. That's the money of the nation. So why not give more subsidies and open a Swiss account for you, and we can share the subsidies. And that was what happened in Russia, right? In many Eastern European countries, right? And as a result, those kind of neoliberalism, Washington consensus-based reform, the intention was good, but the result was the collapse of the economy and even less efficient of the economy. And how come China tried to address the same issue? But China maintains stability and dynamic economic growth. It was China adopted a different transition strategy. China adopted a very pragmatic, dual-track, gradual transition. In recognition of those older firms in the older priority sectors, without protection and subsidy cannot survive, then China continued to provide some kind of transitory protection and subsidies, and to maintain stability. But China liberalized the entry to the labor-intensive sectors, which were replaced in the past. Now China liberalized the entry. Not only to liberalize the entry, China facilitated their growth. Because at the beginning, let's say, the infrastructure in China was very poor. But if they want to compete in the global market, they should have good infrastructure. It was impossible to improve infrastructure for the whole nation simultaneously. So China developed special economic zone, export processing zone. Within the special economic zone and export processing zone, the infrastructure was made good enough. At the beginning, because there are so many distortions in China, business environment were very poor. The government provides some kind of one-stop service in a special economic zone and industrial parks. So if you look into the World Bank doing business indicator, China was very poor, among the worst in the world. But if you doing business in that special economic zone or industrial park, you find the business environment in China was among the best in the world. So you those kind of gradual dual-track approach, China achieved dynamic economic growth because that allowed China to tap into the advantage of late commerce. So that was a difference in the development, in the transition strategy, causing the difference in the transition performance. And here I'd like to say, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a conviction. If you want to do a transition from a planned economy to a market economy, it would have to adopt a structural RP. The conviction at that time, the worst possible approach was those kind of dual-track gradual approach is adopted in China. That was considered as the worst possible approach. And according to those kind of analysis, this kind of dual-track approach was causing the economy to be performing even worse than before the transition. But actually, now it turned out to be the best approach. Okay. And certainly, there are some prices for that. What are the prices? The prices are corruption, as well as income inequalities. And how can the China grow so rapidly and corruption and income inequality also, widening and become more, widespread in the process. That was related to the dual track transition, because it was needed to protect the oil industry, right? To subsidize them. How to subsidize them? The Chinese government retains certain distortions and monopoly position for the oil sectors. And those kind of distortions will create economic rent. And you are going to have rent shaking. That means corruption, right? And not only so, those kind of distortions will also causing the poor people to subsidize the rich people. To give one example, the oil sectors were in capital-intensive sectors. The most important cost for them is the capital cost, right? China was a capital skills economy at the beginning of the transition. And how to subsidize them? So one way to subsidize them was to use large banks in China to transfer the credit to the capital-intensive firms. It's a way to support them. And not only allow them to have access to credit, but the prices of interest was artificially repriced. That was in the case in the 1980s, 1990s. At the beginning, all the firms were state-owned. But because China adopted a dual-track approach, right, allowed the private sector to grow in the new sectors. And some of them becomes very large now. When they become large, they can get credit from the large bank. Certainly, they can also list them in the stock market. But no matter they get credit from the big banks, or they list their company on the stock market. That was a way to subsidize them, right? And those firms are owned, those large firms are owned by the rich people, right? And when they get the credit, what they are listed in a stock market, they get subsidies. Who subsidizes them? The ordinary households, or agricultural households, or small and medium-sized enterprises. They could not get credit or financial service from big banks or stock markets. But they put money into the financial system. They get lower pay, lower return on their deposit and so on. So they're in effect subsidizing those people who can borrow, who can get credit from stock market or big banks. And so you're asking the poor people to subsidize the operation of rich people. Certainly you're going to have, widening of income disparity. But at the same time, to get those kind of credit or to be listed on the stock markets, that means you can immediately get some kind of transfer. And certainly all the people were trying a way to bribe the government official who has the authority to decide who can get the credit, who can be listed on the stock market. And so that's the reason why the corruption become more widespread. That's just one example, and many other distortion have a similar consequence. So that's the prices China paid. But how to get rid of that? The real reason in the 1980s, 1990s, well, up to a few years ago, those kind of subsidies and so on were essential for maintaining stability. Otherwise, those kind of large-scale capital-intensive firms cannot survive. But after almost 40 years of 9.6% growth, China now changed from a low-income country to an upper-middle-income country. Last year, the capital GDP in China was 8,600. And so capital was not scarce in China anymore. And most of those kind of industry now change from going against China's comparative advantages to be consistent with China's comparative advantages. When the industries are consistent with China's comparative advantages, firms in those kind of sectors should be viable. As long as they have good management, they should be profitable. And so the nature of the subsidies changed from, in a Chinese term, 水中送炭 to now 锦上添花. It was a necessity in the past, but now become a privilege. And certainly for the firm, they like to get that privilege, But for the whole society, that means what? We need to pay some social political costs for that. And so it's time to remove all those kind of restrictions. And that was the decision that made in 2013, so-called to deepening the reform and to allow the market to play a decisive role in the resource allocation. And the meaning of that decision is that the Chinese government decided it's time to get rid of those kind of distortions. And as long as China get rid of those kind of distortions, then China can have a well-functioning market economy. And then China can uproot it, can eliminate the roots of the corruption and income disparities. And if China can carry out those kind of reform successfully, how long that China can maintain dynamic economic growth? And the answers, according to my analysis, if you want to grow more dynamically than 3% as in a high-income country, it depends on how large is the technological gap that China still enjoys with the high-income country. But how to measure the gap of technology at the industrial level? I think the best way is to look into the gap of per capita GDP. Because per capita GDP means the average labor productivity in a country. And the average labor productivity reflects the average level of technology and value added in the industries. And also based on the historical statistics of Angus Madison, before he passed away in 2011. He released the estimation up to 2008. And in 2008, the per capita GDP in China, measured by purchasing power parity, was 21% of the US per capita GDP. And that was similar to Japan in 1951, Singapore in 1967, Taiwan, China in 1975, South Korea in 1977. And these 4 economies were among those 13 economies I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. They realized 7% or more growth rate continuously for 25 or more years. They were among those 13 economies. And these 4 East Asian economies, based on the same gap with the US, they enjoyed 20 years of 8% to 9% growth. If they could realize 8 to 9% growth based on these latecomers' advantages, that means that there's a potential for China to have 8% growth continuously for another 20 years from 2008. That means what? The growth potential 8% will still be remained for another 10 years, right? Because now it's only 2017. So most likely, up to 2028, there's a potential of 8% growth in China. But that is a potential, right? And to realize that potential depends on many things. Domestically, China needs to deepen the reform. China also needs to be pragmatic in its modernization drive. It also depends on global economy. And the global economy is not under China's control. And since 2008, the global economy has been slowing down and likely to continue slow down or stagnant. But China can do something by itself. And I think for China, from all my readings, China committed to the market-oriented reform, and China will manage the transition pragmatically as in the past. So I do have confidence that China will be able to grow at about 6% or more continuously for another decade. But even China grow at 6%, what is the implication for the world? China now contributed 18.6% last year to the world economy, right? 6% means what? Each year, China will contribute about 1 percentage point to the global growth. The global growth now is about 3%. That means what? China will continue to contribute about 30% to the global growth. China will continue to be the driver of the global growth in the coming decades. So let me conclude. China, had advantages in pre-modern times when technological innovation drew mainly from the experiences of the peasant or craftsman because of large population in China. And China lagged behind after the paradigm shift of technology innovation from experiences to experiment come sciences. China did not have those kind of paradigm shift. And the reason why China could not have that kind of paradigm shift was some kind of social political institution, which, made China was able to maintain the, integration as a civilization for such a long time, but that caused China to be locked in the traditional way of technological changes. But after this kind of losses, China certainly will have to find a new way to grow. And because China became left behind, so there should be some kind of late common advantages. And in the past, China did not find a good way because China was too ambitious, like other countries, tried to catch up too quickly and gave up their potential. And only after 1978, China started to find a way to tap into the potential. But if you want to tap that potential, you also need to manage the transition because you have a large, stock of non-viable firms in the auto priority sectors. And you need to be pragmatic. And a dual-track transition is a very pragmatic approach, allow China to maintain stability and dynamic economic growth. And if China continues this kind of open-minded as well as pragmatism in the development drive, I think that China will be able to maintain dynamic economic growth in the coming decades. And there are some lessons that we can learn from China also. Because as I mentioned, all the developing countries have the same aspiration to catch up the high-income country. And when I was at the World Bank, I really been touched by the effort of the government, of the elite in the developing country. They have the same aspiration as the Chinese elite or any elite in the developing country. In the past, like in China, they try very hard, but they have a wrong approach. They always use high-income country as a reference to look into what high-income country have, they do not have, or what high-income country can do well, they cannot do well. And they wanted to own what the high-income country have, or to do as the high-income country are doing. But those kind of drive, those kind of effort, with very respectable intention, but the result was always very poor. And so now I'm promoting my new development economics that calls new structural economics. For this, I changed the reference. Every developing country should look at what they have now. And based on what they have, they can do well now. And create a condition to scale up what they can do well in a pragmatic way. What do they have now? Certainly, a low-income country or a developing country always mean they have more labor force or natural resources, and what they did not have is capital. So under the kind of situation, in terms of development, they should develop industry which are consistent with their competitive advantages. determined by what they have, their factor endowments. And every country should have some sector which they have comparative advantages. And you should turn your competitive advantage to national competitiveness. And then the government should create a condition to make those kind of things happen. That's the scaffold they can do well. And in many countries, they inherit all kind of restoration because wrong intervention in the past. And in this process, you also need to manage this kind of transition in a pragmatic way to maintain stability and find a way to unleash your potential. If a developing country can do that, they all have the advantage of backwardness. They can all enjoy the latecomer advantages. And to have 8% or even 10% growth continuously for several decades, create jobs for their people, and hope for the futures, and that will be good for the developing country. And that will also be good for the high-income country, right? For several reasons. If the people can find jobs at their home country, then you are not going to have those kind of illegal immigrants, right? That's the headache in Europe now, right? And they will also provide the market, right? If they have a dynamic growing economy, the purchasing power will be increased, and they will become a larger market for your export. And so you can not only, to avoid the trouble of large inflow of migrants, you can also create jobs by exporting more goods to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lin, for a very stimulating lecture. While you catch your breath and have a sip of water, just to say we have some time now for comments and for questions.
So in 1978, China also adopted the one-child policy, and that policy has been relaxed last year. But still, I think lots of audience in this room, including me, are the only child in their family. So my question is, as our generation has entered or is entering the job market, do you think this lack of population would be a huge concern for China's growth?
Very good questions. One-child policies means Asian will hit China earlier than other countries. China will enter into the Asian society when China is still an upper middle income country. And under this kind of situation, is there going to be a main barrier for dynamic economic growth in China? I think that, yes, it's a potential barrier. But there's some way to cope with that. One thing is that China now has a retirement age which is extremely young. For the female, in general, they retire at the age of 50s. Male workers retire at the age of 55. So in anticipation of reduction of early aging, then we can extend the working ages to cope with this kind of decline in the labor force. But more important than that is the quality of the labor force. Because in the production, it's not only the brutal labor force, it's the quality of the labor force. And how to increase the quality of labor force? Education. And so you can see China now invest a lot in education. I remember in 2000, the graduate of university students, the tertiary education graduate student in 2000 was less than 1 million a year. Last year, it was almost 8 million, increased about 8 times in a very short period of time. And I think that the education can overcompensate for the decline of the labor force. So yes, we need to pay attention to that, but that will not make me pessimistic because of less of the labor force.
Thank you very much for the very stimulating talk. maybe I'm not sure whether I misunderstood you or missed some parts.
Yeah.
You didn't. I just wonder to what extent the political system played in the development of China.
Yeah.
Is the development achieved in spite of the political system or because of the political system? I mean, 2 days ago, Xi Jinping called the whole nation to have confidence in its political system. And also it says, China sets a good example for the whole world for fast development and a stable society. To what extent do you share this view?
I think that to answer your question, you will make me politically incorrect. Okay. My analysis shows political system actually is not a determinant of economic growth. Right development strategies would be more important than the political system. And when I say your question will make me politically incorrect, because in the past, in the West, always say political system is the determinant of economic performance. If you do not have a democracy, then you cannot have a sustained growth. That was a political correct position in the past. But now I can answer this question without so much in political incorrectness. Because from my analysis, to maintain stability of the society will be more important. And to maintain the stability of the society, the most important one is to create a job and a better future for the people. And to create a job and a better future for the people, actually you can do that in a more authoritarian regime or a democratic regime. In a more authoritarian regime, you can look at all the East Asian economies. They do well. They have an authoritarian regime. But do you know that which country is the best performing country in Africa? Mauritius. Mauritius, in 1960s, James Smith was invited to write a country report for Mauritius. And after a long studies of Mauritius, the report said Mauritius was a hopeless country. And at that time, it was a tiny economy, and they have a monoculture, only produce sugars. They inherited French political system. Multi-party could never get into consensus, and they also adopt the import substitution strategy with all kinds of distortion. But now it turned out to be the best performing African country. The per capita GDP in Mauritius now is more than $10,000 US. And how come Mauritius could do well after 1970s, after, the picture changed after 1970s, was exactly they adopt a similar dual track approach to transit from an inward-looking, development strategy to an export-oriented development strategy. And when they did this kind of transition, they did not adopt shock therapy. They, just like China, domestically, they retain all the distortion. But they set up an export purchasing zone to attract textile and garment industry to relocate from Taiwan and Hong Kong. And in export purchasing zone, they liberalize everything. So the transition strategy, the development strategy was exactly the same as in China and as most of the East Asian economies. But they have a democratic system. So from this comparison, I'm convinced more important is to have a right development strategy, to have a right transition strategies. And if you have this kind of strategies, you can be successful in any political system. But if you have a wrong strategies, no matter what kind of political system you have, you are going to have a very poor economic performance. Just like in China before 1978, the performance was poor, right? And if you say democracy is so important, how come India could not outperform China. I made a lot of very careful comparison. In 1978, when China started transition, India's per capita GDP was 20% above China. Today, India per capita GDP is only 20% of China. And political system, they have, India is always proud to say, we have the largest democracy in the world. But economically, they perform poorly. And here is that, if you have a right development strategies, you create jobs, you create dynamic growth, and you can also create a political stability in your country, no matter what kind of system you have. Okay.
And after Marshall, after the Marshall lecture, truly honored to listen to you give a lecture on the Needham lecture. And may I ask a question on the cost of China's growth? You mentioned China's poor people save money at a very low deposit rate to subsidy the elites running the company. And as we know that like Jack Ma is spreading its financial inclusive industry all over the world. Yeah. What is the result of China's financial inclusive industry, not the latecomer, but become a world-leading industry? And what is the effect and impact to the China's economy in the future? Thank you.
That's a very good question. For the financial sector reform, there are two things we need to do. One is to improve financial structure, to make financial services accessible to the poor people, to agricultural households, to the small and medium-sized enterprises. They should have access. Currently, they do not have access. That's one thing. And secondly, need to liberalize the control of the prices of financial services, the interest rate and so on. And we need to do both things. And the e-commerce and so on, or Alipay, those kind of new instrument would be favorable, but they cannot substitute for small and medium-sized local banks, because those are used for mainly consumption purpose. And if you want to make investment, this kind of new instrument, internet finance, is still not a good way. And to develop small and medium-sized local financial institution would be a way to make financial services accessible to now underprivileged people. And I'm delighted to say the Chinese government now understands that. So May this year, the decision is to improve financial structure along the way I just recommended. And by that, I think the root cause of one of the distortion will be removed, and that will contribute to a better allocation of resources and a better income distribution as well.
Would you like to take the risk of commenting on the West situation at the moment? The financial situation as a result of excessive risk-taking that led to 2008, and now fairly sustained, and America backing away of quantitative easing and printing of money, which seems inevitably like I love the way you call subsidies sort of distortions of putting more and more money into the hands of the rich and the powerful and less elsewhere. How do we recover from that problem? Will it recover itself? I mean, the US is scaling back. Europe is not. Do you want to comment on all of that?
I think that's a very good question. I think we should now listen more to Kenshin instead of to the Russian Expectation School in Chicago. Because certainly after the global financial crisis, and you have unemployment and so on, you have slowdown in the economy, and the government will have a responsibility to maintain the job and the stability, right? But for a long time, people go against budget deficit. But you need to stabilize the economy So they rely too much on quantitative easing in the monetary side. And those kind of quantitative easing actually is very ineffective because it reduces the cost for investment. But during the recession, people would not have incentive to make investment in the real sectors because you already have excess capacity. And under that kind of situation, they use low interest rate fund to make speculation on stock markets. And for example, in the US, in 2007, the Dow Jones Index was 18,000. And at the time, everyone knows there was a bubble there. And now, the Dow Jones went up to 24,000. But the real economy was even worse than 2007, right? So that means the bubble was even bigger. It's even bigger. And how come the bubble now is so big? Because money is so cheap. But they borrowed the money, they did not want to make investment in the real sectors, and they made investment, or they short, or they speculate on the stock markets. So under this condition, it would be better to allow the government to have a larger fiscal deficit and they use the deficit to make investment in infrastructure, and especially in the bottleneck reduction type of infrastructure, or to make investment in infrastructure which are too old, too outdated. And that kind of investment can create jobs, at the same time enhance productivities. And this idea is the Keynesian ideas. But so far, most people listen to my alma mater, Chicago, instead of to Cambridge.
Thank you. I got the last question. So thank you so much for your presentation. It's very stimulating. I have a lot of questions, but I asked you 3 just for now.
I will also only answer 1.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious, the 6% growth that you suggest, how much it is coming from Belt and Road strategy?
Will not be large, because Belt and Road is an initiative, and that takes time to select a project, that takes time to implement. And I don't think that is going to be contribute to a large percentage in China immediately. I think it's a long-term strategy. It's not a short-term counter-cyclical intervention.
Okay, really last question is, what advice do you have for the UK government on Brexit? Like, should it adapt the Chinese strategies of stability and dynamic growth?
Like a professor here, this is a good question, but the government should commission me a study first before I can give the answer.